Hello juniors, welcome back. This is my second teaching video on crime and punishment. I talked with you guys a little bit this morning during our live session, and we reviewed some of the key points of vacillation in Raskolnikov's mind as he contemplates whether or not he will in fact be able to act on this principle or this theory that he has taken hold of, or that has at least taken hold of him, in which it's basically utilitarianism, where he is weighing the rightness or wrongness of an action based on the good that will come from that action. So he would like to think that he is capable of uttering a new world, embracing a new idea, living in accordance to a principle that he would like to think is proof of his being absolutely free. He wants to claim an unfettered freedom. And that's something we talked about a little bit with Milton. And as you will recall, Milton said that reason tells us what is true and right. God gives us absolute free will to decide what we will do, what actions we will take, but that our will is only truly free when what we do with it comports with or lines up with, matches up with reason. So if we act in a way that is outside of or contrary to what God has said constitutes reason and truth, then we really are not free. We are using our free will as a type of enslavement. Dostoevsky would very much agree with that. And today, as we move into part 2, we will be looking at the results of Raskolnikov's decision to murder the pawnbroker. So this is where it does get a lot like Macbeth. The first part of Macbeth is him struggling with whether or not he will kill the king. Once he decides to kill the king, the play then takes a turn, and we watch as he and his wife begin to unravel emotionally and spiritually, and ultimately end up dying, thus proving the truth once again of James 1:15, one of my favorite verses. So today we are going to talk a little bit about suffering. Before I actually get into part 2, I just kind of want to lay the land, give you the lay of the land for part 2, so that as you're reading it, you know what the highlights are, you know what to pay attention to. I don't want to tell you anything that will ruin the story, but I do want you to be familiar with the characters, with what's happening, and what the big ideas are. So I'll move into that in just a second. Right now, I want to start with this quotation, because it's going to lead us to an understanding of Dostoevsky's views on the value and purpose of suffering. So let me draw your attention to this quotation that I wrote on the board. This is actually also in your introductory materials to the book that I provided you. He says, "There is no happiness in comfort. Happiness is brought by suffering. Human beings are not born to happiness, but earn happiness, and always through suffering." That's a really powerful statement, and just because he said it doesn't mean that you need to accept that as true. You need to think about it. You need to sit with that for a while, and I think reading this book will help you to do that. Another thing he says is, the ways in which God finds the man are inscrutable. They are unknowable, uninterpretable. They are mysterious. We don't know what God is doing in a person's life. We don't know. So we have to be very careful not to assume that we've got it all figured out when we're looking at someone or looking even at ourselves. God is doing a work. He is absolutely sovereign. His ways are inscrutable, but he finds the man. He finds the man. He draws the man. He saves the man, but his ways are inscrutable. Both of these are potential quotations that you can use or will use to frame your end of the book essay. So as you're reading this book and we're talking through all the ideas, keep these things in mind. They're related, but either one of them would work well, because we want to look at, we admit that God's ways are inscrutable. We want to look at how he appears to be working or finding the man, in this case Raskolnikov, through the story that is told in Crime and Punishment. So before I move on, let's take a look at this. There's no happiness in comfort. This makes me think of a really well-known quotation by C.S. Lewis. If you ever get a chance to read his book, The Problem of Pain, I highly recommend it. I go back to it probably every couple of years. It's well annotated, both in my book and on my heart. It's just a powerful, powerful powerful book. So, did I say powerful? Powerful. C.S. Lewis says about pain, I'll probably have to paraphrase, but he says that God whispers to us in our pleasures, and he speaks to us in our conscience or through our conscience, but he shouts to us in our pain. And that pain is God's megaphone to a deaf world. I always say deaf and dying world because I think that sounds better, but who am I to correct C.S. Lewis? So pain is God's megaphone to a deaf world. I think that's true, and I hope that you guys are learning more and more that that is true. When we're comfortable, we become complacent. When we become complacent, we don't necessarily reach out to God or recognize him or depend upon him in the same way that we do when he gets our attention. So, not that God wants us to suffer all the time. God wants us to be comfortable. He wants us to have pleasure, but he also uses suffering, or at least some kinds of suffering, as part of his sovereignty. So, we refer to this, Dostoevsky's view on suffering, as the redemptive power of suffering. So let me read you a couple of paragraphs here about this. It says it as well as I would. For Dostoevsky, suffering is requisite to the human condition in that it is one of the ways that God grabs our attention, humbles us, and renders us more compassionate toward others. If I could stop there for just a second. In part one, we looked at several examples of where Raskolnikov is trying to utter this new world and throw off this moral limitation, this code by which he's grown up believing and living. He wants to throw that off. And so every time we see him responding with compassion, he is struggling to throw off that moral code. He is struggling to go against nature. Okay, so keep that in mind. Since love for God means love for others, anything that causes us to trust less in ourselves and in our own comforts draws us together in Christian love, which ultimately leads to true happiness. This is the horizontal value of suffering. The Christian life is communal, not individualistic. That's very important to Dostoevsky. And when we are able to better understand, serve, and love our neighbor, the better we bear the image of Christ. The vertical value of suffering is that it reminds us that Christ suffered on our behalf, that we might have the means of seeking the forgiveness of sins and thus redemption. When we suffer, we seek him and not ourselves. Thus, suffering becomes a means of letting go of our prideful self-sufficiency, replacing it with dependence on Christ alone, and deeper understanding of what our sin cost him and how great his love is for us. So that is what Dostoevsky means when he talks about redemptive suffering. He says it helps us to let go of our self-sufficiency. It causes us to realign ourselves vertically with God and horizontally with man. Of course, you see the cross there, and that is incredibly necessary in our lives. So we looked last week at how Raskolnikov suffers as he tries to decide whether or not to commit the murder. Then he commits the murder, and you would think that all would be well. He did it. He had the courage to do what he was afraid he didn't have the courage. He was the kind of person who could utter a new world. He was extraordinary in this sense, and he should have been happy, but he's not happy. So if you remember in part one, it opens up with pathetic fallacy where his little apartment or his room or whatever he has is all cramped and he's isolated. And I think the walls are yellow and there's just all this negative imagery going on that is used to illustrate or reveal his inner condition. And when you look at part two, notice how that Dostoevsky is doing that again. He is sick. He's feverish, he wakes up, he frets, then he falls back asleep. He's a mess. And what's going to change here is that he now has to make a different kind of decision. And I'll just tell you right now that the decision that he has to make, just hold this in your head the whole time you're reading part two, the decision that he has to make is whether to commit suicide because of his suffering. He's really suffering. So to commit suicide or to confess. That's his new struggle, and he is struggling. So let's leave it at that. I'm about to move into what actually happens in each of the chapters. Before I do, I'd like to run through a couple of new names for you because Russian names are tricky. So I'll be really fast. This is all on that handout that I gave you with the names on it, but you should have that in front of you as you're reading. So Razumikin is Raskolnikov's friend, and he is a bit of a literary foil to Raskolnikov. He is good-hearted and sane and reasonable, loving, compassionate, and good. So he's great. Don't get mixed up. I usually just call Raskolnikov Raz. No, that won't help you. Like when I write it, I just write R-A-S, and when I mean Razumikin, I just write R-A-Z. Lushin is the guy that wants to marry Raskolnikov's sister. And notice that sometimes they go by Lushin, most of the time sometimes they'll go by, this is Peter Petrovich. Remember, Russian men's names end in Ovich or Ivich, and that name happens a lot. So you might get confused with some of the characters. This Porfiry Petrovich or Petrovich is the police investigator, and he is a really important character. So just keep those two separate if you can. Then you've got a couple of names that start with Z. Zazimov is just a doctor, and Nikodem Fomich is a police officer. He'll usually go by Fomich. Then Zamatov is just a clerk at the police station, and Nikolai, he is a painter who actually gets accused of the murder and then falsely confesses for some reason. So those are some new characters. Keep those guys in mind. And I guess we're ready to move into an overview of the chapters. Like part 1, part 2 has 7 chapters. I'm not going to talk about everything in it. I'm just going to look at my notes and then give you guys the big picture and then give you your reading schedule for the week. So in the first chapter, he wakes up and he is fretful and he tries to hide everything, and he gets summoned to the police station. You can just imagine what this does to him. It's the day after he commits the murder and he gets called to the police station. So he's freaking out. Notice there, like I said, how he is described, the loneliness, the isolation. One of the things that Dostoevsky likes to do is show how sin separates us from others. A pivotal quotation from this chapter is, quote, "He felt as if a nail were being driven into his skull." I want you to pay attention to that. He goes to the police station, thinks they know he's guilty, is about to confess, and then something happens. That's all I'm going to say. He ends up not confessing. He rushes out. Pay attention to that last page. In the second chapter, he takes his stuff that he got from the pawnbroker and he hides it behind a big rock, and he's happy and joyful. And then he passes this spot where he had seen that drunk girl in part 1, and he gets really agitated because he remembers that he felt compassion for her, and this goes against his theory. He sees compassion in himself as a type of weakness. So he gets mad at himself, and then all of a sudden he has this insight, and he thinks he never even counted the money that he took from the pawnbroker. He just kind of took this and he throws it away, gets rid of it, hides it, whatever, but he never even counts it. And he suddenly realizes that he did not take the money. He did not murder her and steal her money because he wanted to do good for himself or good for others with it. So that kind of shakes him up a little bit, because then he thinks, well, why did I do that? So there's a beautiful moment in this chapter I want you guys to pay attention to. I think it's in this one. Let me make sure. Yes. He is standing on this bridge, and he's looking across the Neva River, and he looks out at, there's this palace and there's this chapel, and he is bothered by the fact that every time he has stood in this spot and looked over at this palace and this chapel, they should have inspired in him a sense of serenity. There's just this great beauty and serenity, but he never feels that. He never has a positive response. Instead, he's overcome by a vague and mysterious emotion that leaves him, quote, strangely cold. For this gorgeous picture was blank and lifeless. Significance. Think about what the palace represents. The palace represents the law. It's civilization, law, government, limits, etc. And the chapel, of course, represents faith in God. So he's looking at these two things and he feels cold inside. He feels lifeless. He can't appreciate the beauty of them. He just is incapable of feeling what he ought to be feeling, because he's given into this idea that pure reason and rationality are superior to God and his law. So then again in this chapter, he's walking along and suddenly I know Crime and Punishment's not a comedy, but strange things make me laugh. And he's going along and suddenly he's yelled at by this coachman who lashes him, just starts beating him. Now remember the horse scene? Remember the dream about the horse? So that's kind of interesting whenever you see this horse imagery. So this elderly man, this coachman starts lashing at him because Raskolnikov kind of got in the way and almost tripped up this guy's horses. And then this elderly woman shoves 20 kopecks in his hand. I don't think that's a lot of money, but she gives him this money because she thinks that Raskolnikov is a beggar. And she says to him, "Take it, my good man, in Christ's name." So here is a woman who is showing compassion, love for another, trying to help him out in the name of Jesus. Well, you will get to see how he reacts to that. You can probably guess how he reacts to that. But anyway, he takes the money and he throws it into the river. So once again, renouncing everything that kindness, that gift, that love that this woman tried to bestow on him represents. Tosses it out. Next chapter, he's in and out. He's in his apartment and he's in and out of consciousness. His friend Razumikin has been caring for him and has brought this doctor Zazimov, and Raskolnikov's mother has sent money. So we saw how he reacted when he got the letter that informed him that his daughter was going to marry this guy just to help out Raskolnikov, and he rejected that. So he responds about the same to this gift of his mother's money. She doesn't have much money. She worked very hard for what she has. He knows she's sacrificing for him, and he just cannot. He just cannot bear it. So again, in and out. He just wants to be alone. Again, that need to be completely isolated from all others. Then in the next chapter, this will be chapter 4, the doctor and Razumikin check on him, and they tell him that there were a couple of guys that were initially suspected as having committed the murder. And if you recall that during the murder, there were these two guys that knocked on the door while he was in the midst of this crime. And then they ran away and did something and came back. And in the meantime, he had escaped. So those two guys are kind of suspected, but then they're dismissed. And this other guy, this Nikolai, he's a painter. He was there for some reason, and he gets accused of doing the murder, or he's at least suspected. And then later on, he decides to confess for some weird reason, but there's more about that later. They're talking about the murder, and one of the things that really bothers Raskolnikov is that people are talking about how sloppily the murder was done. It wasn't done well. In fact, some earrings were left in a box, I think, behind the door, and that really freaks him out, because if he really were the Ubermensch, which again we'll talk about later, if he really was above the law because of his own excellence, then he would not have felt any fear. He wouldn't have felt any guilt, and he would not have made any mistakes. He believes that the reason criminals make mistakes is because they're afraid, etc. So he just sees that, he's rattled by that, because maybe he isn't all that he thinks he is. And if he isn't, then he's just a commoner, just like the pawnbroker. He's no better than the person he murdered. So his theory is kind of going out the door. He kind of needs to be the Übermensch, or to have had a very good reason for what he did in order to justify it. Okay, chapter 5, moving on. Illusion. This is his sister's, the guy who's interested in her. He shows up, of course, he wants to meet Raskolnikov, and it does not go well. It's a very ugly meeting. He gives a philosophical talk that you might want to pay attention to. And I'm just going to read a quote so that when you get there, you'll pay attention to it. And he's talking about progress. So he, again, represents progress and these new ideas and these radical ways of thinking. And he, of course, the idea that somebody might sacrifice for another human being, or that we might put someone else's interest first, that we might love our neighbor more than self, is alien to these progressive thinkers. So here's a quotation from Illusion. He says, "Up until now, for instance, if I were told, 'Love thy neighbor,' what came of it? It meant I had to tear my coat in half to share it with my neighbor, and then we were both left half naked. Science now tells us, love yourself above everyone else, for everything in the world relies on self-interest. You love yourself and manage your own affairs properly, and your coat remains whole. Economic truth adds that the better private affairs are organized in society, the more whole coats, so to speak, the firmer its foundations, and the better organized common welfare shall be. Therefore, in acquiring wealth solely and exclusively for myself, I am acquiring, so to speak, for everyone, and helping to get my neighbor a little more than a torn coat. And that is not because of my private personal liberality, but because of a general advance. The idea is simple, but unhappily, it has been a long time reaching us because we have been hindered by idealism and sentimentality." So this is kind of the idea behind capitalism. You know, if everybody is given the freedom to advance his own interests, he will be motivated to advance his own interest, and in advancing his own interest, at least economically, it advances everybody's interests. That is something to be discussed at another time, but if you ever want to read someone who takes that idea and really runs with it, read some Ayn Rand, because yeah, she's interesting, but she's crazy. Okay, so let's move on to the next chapter. We're almost there. Chapter 6. Raskolnikov is so tired of this agony of soul, this sickness and this agony and this pressure and this fear. Will I get caught? Have I done wrong? Who am I? All this. He cannot stand it anymore. And so he gets up out of his bed, throws on his clothes, goes out onto the streets, and he decides, he says, "This day I will decide what I am going to do." So again, he's either going to commit suicide or he's going to confess. He doesn't know. So then we have to take a look at how he vacillates throughout the day. And I will ask you some questions about that as you do your reading, but that's basically what's going on. There's one quotation that I know is going to give you trouble, so I want to go through that with you. He says this. He's looking at the simple peasants and how simple and happy their lives are. And he says, he actually thinks, you know what? Life is worth living no matter what. Even if I am constrained to this little tiny space, basically, he says, even if I am locked up forever in this little tiny cell, life is life, and it is worth having no matter what the circumstances. So here's the actual quote. "Where is it I've read that someone condemned to death says or thinks before life that if he had to live on some high rock, on some narrow ledge, that he'd only got room to stand with the ocean, everlasting darkness, everlasting solitude, everlasting tempest around him, if he had to remain standing on a square yard of space all his life, it were better to live like that than to die at once, only to live, and live life, whatever it may be." So at that moment, he affirms the value of life, which means that he is thinking about confessing. Again, it's either suicide or confession. Then he goes into the tavern and he has a conversation with Zametov, which is one of the, he's a clerk at the police station. And there's this kind of cat and mouse game where Zametov, I think, suspects Raskolnikov, and Raskolnikov is actually testing Zametov. He's actually saying, well, you know what? Maybe I did the murder. Maybe I didn't. I don't know if you guys know anything about O.J. Simpson, but he wrote a book saying, I didn't do the murder. He was accused of murdering his wife. And he said, if I didn't do the murder, but if I did, this is how it would have been. And of course he did the murder, but that's off point. Okay, so then he's going along, he's talking to this guy. He says, all right, I think I will confess as planned. So he leaves the tavern, he's going along, he's on his way to confess, and all of a sudden he runs into a scene in the street. I won't tell you what happens, I don't think, but he helps in this situation. Well, I think I have to tell you. Okay, so it's Marmeladov. Remember Marmeladov? He's drunk and he's been run over in the street, and so they grab him and they take him to his place. And oh, this is so cool. So they take him there, and he does it again. He gives them money. So he sees the family suffering. I don't know if I think Marmeladov actually dies, and they have to have money for a funeral, and so Raskolnikov has a little bit of money, and again he gives them this little bit of money, which is fine, and then he leaves, and remember, he's on his way to confess, and all of a sudden he's on the stairs again, and he has a reversal. So when you read about that reversal, I want you to think about Jekyll and Hyde. So he is Jekyll on his way to confess to the police, and all of a sudden Hyde comes out. If you guys remember Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, that description of Hyde and all his power and his stature and his ferocity, this is what happens. It's almost like he suddenly becomes Hyde. Let me give you a quote. It says, like Hyde, he experiences a, quote, wild, hysterical sensation in which, nonetheless, there is an element of unbearable delight. So remember, nature means natural man, moral man. So all opposition of nature has been broken. There's no more Jekyll, he's all Hyde, and then there's this wonderful quotation, and you can just see him on the stairwell just proclaiming this. He says, now the kingdom of reason and light has come, and of will and strength. We'll try our strength now. So he has decided, no, I am going to live life on my terms. I am not going to confess. I am going to live powerfully according to my own way of doing life. So he's going to test his strength. All day he's been struggling with this oppression and this guilt and this need to be relieved from this inner turmoil, but ultimately he scorns it. It's interesting, you'll be a little bit confused because Sonia, remember sweet Sonia, who's gone into prostitution to keep food on the table for her family, is of course called to the apartment, and there's a younger sister named Polenka, and Polenka chases after Raskolnikov, meets him on the stairs, and says, tell us your name, or, you know, where can we find you? How do we thank you for this great gift? And he says to Polenka, he says, you know, remember me in your prayers. And that's a little bit confusing, because if he has just renounced his faith completely, why would he want her to pray? He later says it's just a backup plan, you know, just in case. It's all silly, but just in case. So that's kind of interesting. He leaves there knowing he's not going to confess. And that's where things end. Oh, there is this one more moment I want to bring to your attention. He runs into Zametov on the stairs, and Zametov says to him, you're covered with blood, because he's been helping Marmeladov. He's physically covered with blood. And Raskolnikov says, and it's kind of eerie, he says, I am covered with blood indeed. That makes me think of on Easter morning when we say, he is risen, and the other person says, he is risen indeed. You are covered with blood. I am covered with blood indeed. And that is how part 2 ends. So enjoy your reading. I will talk with you more about this next week.